Hey everybody, thanks for inviting me to talk. I hope you can hear me okay. I feel like I'm like super far away from everybody. My talk today, I know the agenda says lots of things, growth, nutrition, development, and ADHD. As it relates to nutrition, that's a lot to cover in 45 minutes, so I figured I'd just focus on ADHD, which can fill up 45 minutes by itself, and is a good paradigm, I think, as you've probably heard other talks today about the intersection of mental health and ADHD, or mental health and nutrition. There's a lot of overlap in terms of how we think about nutrition plays into mental health, and ADHD is a good paradigm of that, both in terms of how nutrition is important to consider, as well as kind of a lot of the uncertainty that still results from a lot of the research that we know about the relationship between nutrition and ADHD and mental health in general. With that, I will start by helping answer the question, so what do we think of when we think of ADHD? And hopefully, as I've been joking, hopefully this presentation will be about ADHD and not a simulation of ADHD, because it may be a little bit disorganized, but bear with me. So ADHD is clinically significant inattention and or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with functioning. It is not a disorder unless it interferes with some kind of functioning in some way. Symptoms are present prior to age 12. It used to be that you had to have symptoms prior to age 7, and they realized that ADHD can manifest later than age 7, but now the diagnostic criteria, as specified by the DSM-5, say prior to age 12. You have to have difficulties across 2 or more settings. If it is only a home problem, or is it only a school problem, it is not ADHD. ADHD is not a school disorder, so when we counsel families about that, it's like if he's having problems at school and everything else is fine, it's not ADHD. And it has not better explained by another mental disorder. So those are the basic criteria for how we diagnose ADHD. As you can see, as like many other mental health conditions, it is very phenotypic. It's very what you can see, what you can observe, what the behaviors are that you can actually see. So the specificity of what's actually going on inside the brain is not really told by these criteria. We just know there's a problem and we have to do something about it. But what factors play into that can be as diverse as the number of people who have ADHD. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Why do we worry about ADHD, and why is it important for everyone who may come into the life of somebody with ADHD? There are lots of factors that are affected by ADHD. Like everyone can understand, educational achievement is one of the first things that we see as a problem manifesting with ADHD. People can't pay attention in school, they can't focus on their work, they can't achieve what their potential is, and so they have underachievement. They can have social or relationship difficulties. Everyone can probably think back to when they were in kindergarten or first grade and think like that kid probably had ADHD because he was the one who was standing on the chairs and he was shouting and he was running around the room, and everyone was like, I don't want to be friends with that guy. And people with ADHD, especially children, they don't really know why what they're doing is not ideal. So they don't understand the social stigma that may come with it, and that leads to a lot of mental health comorbidities early on. ADHD is certainly fraught with mental health risks later on in life, including depression, including suicidal ideation. There was one study that followed a population in Rochester, Minnesota for a long period of time and found that people with ADHD are 5 times likelier to have suicidal thinking or suicidal ideation. And so it is a fairly big deal if it's not treated or managed well. Employment challenges later in life, and certainly a risk for substance abuse because of the way ADHD is neurobiologically. And so good segue to that. ADHD is a neurobiological disorder. First and foremost, we know there are differences in the brains of people with ADHD compared to brains of people who don't have ADHD. So you can see a lot of different connections here that are involved in ADHD. When you scan people's brains and average it together, you find that there are lower volumes in several brain regions. So the basal ganglia, cerebellum, and several areas of the cortex that connect to those other regions. So those are all areas that are associated with executive function, motor planning, coordination, lots of things that are not working very well in ADHD. And there's decreased connectivity in the frontostriatal and frontoparietal connections. So the frontal lobe up here in the brain is what helps you make decisions, okay, and helps you kind of not make the wrong decisions, helps guide you through life for executive functioning. That has to connect to many other parts of the brain in order for it to function appropriately. And when it's not working well, then it may manifest as ADHD. There is a lot of variability among neuroimaging and genetic studies. Again, like the individualizability of ADHD is really, really hard. You know, we have to consider people as individuals and not necessarily make generalizations based on imaging studies, because there's just so much variability, and that manifests clinically as well. So, what role does exogenous nutrition play in ADHD? Obviously, as you've been hearing about, lots of different conditions actually have a connection to nutrition. These are things you may have heard before. So ADHD is a problem with food additives. Like all those artificial colorings in foods is going to make all the kids hyper and crazy. Too much sugar. Yep, sugar makes people hyper. Or is it an inadequate intake of certain vitamins and minerals? That has certainly been talked about, and we'll get into that a little bit more detail. And so, yeah, the evidence is somewhat inconsistent across studies, and we'll go into that a little bit more, just to know kind of where our brains need to be in terms of thinking about questions related to nutrition and ADHD. To set the stage, let's talk about dopamine. What's dopamine? Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is highly prevalent in many, many parts of the brain that are specific to the reward pathway and many other functions. So motor control, you know, dopamine is something that in Parkinson's disease is certainly not working well, so it's involved in motor control and motor planning. Dopamine does a lot. In particular, the reward network is something that we talk a lot about in ADHD. If you think about somebody with ADHD, they're constantly seeking novelty. They're constantly seeking the next best thing. Their reward pathway is constantly reaching out there trying to find something to latch onto. And when you're like that, you can't really necessarily pay attention or get your executive functioning going in a specific direction. So dopamine is, in fact, the neurotransmitter we talk a lot about related to ADHD, in part because we know there are differences in brains of people with ADHD related to how dopamine works, as well as how the medications work. All the stimulant medications like Ritalin, they increase dopamine. And so these are the pathways that you can see. We talked about the frontal connections to the other parts of the brain. You can see those there in the reward network. And this is how dopamine goes. So at the top you see the first nerve cell, which is going to talk to the other nerve cell below it. And so dopamine comes to the transporters and it gets released, and then it sits there in that synaptic space and interacts with the dopamine receptors that are lining there in blue. And that signals a nerve cell going down. And so in people with ADHD, dopamine doesn't really work well. And so when you stimulate dopamine, what you're actually doing is you're preventing dopamine from getting out of that space in between those nerve cells. So if you give somebody Ritalin, you're allowing dopamine to hang out longer in there, because the idea is that they don't have enough there. And if you can just stimulate dopamine to be around a little bit longer, then maybe you can improve the functioning of those pathways that help you with attention and regulation of your body. And so dopamine is important in ADHD. And the reason why we talk about dopamine in relation to nutrition is because of the way that dopamine is made in your body. Dopamine, gosh, everyone's having like a seizure now because I'm throwing up molecules. I know, I'm sorry. So dopamine is made in a relatively complex process, as many molecules are. But if you can see at the top left of the slide, you have something called phenylalanine, which is a precursor to many neurotransmitters, not just dopamine, but norepinephrine, and epinephrine as well. And so 50% of your dietary phenylalanine is used for tyrosine synthesis, which is that next molecule down, which phenylalanine hydroxylase converts phenylalanine to tyrosine, and then tyrosine hydroxylase takes that tyrosine and converts it to dopa. Tyrosine hydroxylase requires iron to work properly, so iron is a cofactor for tyrosine hydroxylase, and then it gets converted to dopamine with the help of aromatic amino acid decarboxylase and vitamin B6. So you see there how dopamine is made. There are a lot of vitamins, minerals, amino acids that are involved in the production of dopamine. So the question has arisen do these things matter in terms of how we treat ADHD or how we understand ADHD? So let's talk about phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is the precursor to dopamine. It's an essential amino acid. As you know, that means you have to ingest it in order for your body to actually use it, because your body doesn't produce it. And these are the dietary sources. You can get it in a lot of places, breast milk and formula. In fact, formula has quite a bit of phenylalanine a lot of times, and some people think it may be too much. Eggs, chicken, beef, soybeans, liver, and aspartame, which is an artificial sweetener that we'll talk about a little bit later in relation to why people think you shouldn't eat sweeteners for ADHD. Are people with ADHD, do they have differences in how much phenylalanine they have in their body? That's a good question to ask, considering how important phenylalanine is in making dopamine. And this is a study that looked at many different studies about phenylalanine, and you can see they're pretty mixed. There's really not any consistency. Some studies have shown that there is a higher level of phenylalanine in ADHD patients. Some studies have shown that there's a lower level of phenylalanine in ADHD patients. It's not really something that seems to be anything that correlates with ADHD symptoms. Now, it hasn't stopped people from doing studies about phenylalanine and trying to treat people with ADHD with phenylalanine. But there's really no evidence that supplementing with phenylalanine has any impact on improving ADHD. There's really only one study from about 30 years ago that looked at phenylalanine supplementation in a 2-week double-blind randomized crossover study. So it was a decent study. Mood improved, but in a 3-month open label extension, there were no improvements. All improvements were lost. So again, like I talked about, many formulas, infant formulas, contain higher than needed levels of phenylalanine. There's been studies that have shown that the dietary requirements of phenylalanine are actually less than what many formulas provide. Formula-fed infants end up having higher plasma phenylalanine and tyrosine concentrations than those fed breast milk or mother's milk. And there's the thought that if you overwhelm the body with phenylalanine, it doesn't really process it very well, and it may not necessarily get to the right pathway. So that's why some people think that higher levels of phenylalanine may not be a good thing. Okay, let's talk about that right now. So that's tyrosine hydroxylase. There it is. Yep, more molecules. But the most important part of this slide is that you can see that iron is very important. It's a cofactor for tyrosine hydroxylase, which converts tyrosine to L-DOPA. This has gotten a ton of attention in the ADHD world regarding how important iron may be for ADHD. If you look at, I'm going to show a lot of these slides, so hopefully everybody may be somewhat familiar with what a meta-analysis looks like. And so this is a summary of a bunch of studies that looked at how much iron people with ADHD have in their blood compared to those without ADHD. And so if you take a bunch of studies that look at this and you combine them all together and you look at the effect how all the studies compare to each other, then you get this little black diamond at the bottom, which is supposed to tell you whether or not there's a statistically significant trend in either direction. So 0 is like the neutral point, and then anything above 0 means that there's a higher level of iron in people with ADHD. Anything below that is a lower level of iron in people with ADHD, and you can see it's pretty much right in the middle. They did not find, through a big meta-analysis of multiple studies, that there is a difference in the blood iron concentrations related to in people with ADHD versus people who don't have ADHD. Does that mean that iron is not necessarily important? Not really, because it may not necessarily be the blood iron that matters so much. So they looked at something else called the ferritin. So ferritin is how your body stores iron. It just kind of keeps it around until it needs it. And so they compared ferritin levels in kids with ADHD to those without ADHD. And you can see that diamond is now shifted wholly to the left of that 0 point, which means that the trend is that there's a lower ferritin level in people with ADHD. And so, is it consistent across studies? No. You find some studies that have found a significantly higher ferritin level in ADHD. You found a lot of studies that are in the middle, and especially if those bars on these the squares actually cross 0, then it's probably not really a significant trend. But you can see a lot of these studies that actually show a lower ferritin and ADHD are like by the same author, so who knows what people he was looking at. So this is important because ferritin is actually thought to be linked to many functions that relate to self-regulation. So ADHD obviously is a disorder of self-regulation. Restless leg syndrome is also associated with low ferritin. And so if you have restless legs, you think you're more hyperactive, then you have a more tendency to move. That may be kind of contributing to hyperactivity, and or sleep difficulties, which may also be contributing to hyperactivity during the day. If you look at ADHD severity in kids with and without iron deficiency, this is a frank iron deficiency, then you find significant effects. So everybody knows that iron deficiency is bad in multiple ways. Iron deficiency has many effects on your cognitive potential. And related to ADHD, if you have an iron deficiency, you have a much higher severity of ADHD. And so there's definitely an association between ADHD and iron deficiency. Iron deficiency is bad. That's pretty obvious. Does iron supplementation work, though? Interesting study that was done to look at supplementing iron for individuals with ADHD, and this is not people who have an iron deficiency. These are folks who just underwent a trial of iron supplementation, just thinking maybe like if we kind of boost up the iron, then we can make more dopamine and make these circuits work better. So as you can see from this graph here, so the bars on the left of the graph are at week 4 of iron supplementation, and so the light gray is placebo, and then the dark gray is the iron supplemented folks. And so you can see there's they both had a lot of improvement. There was a mean reduction in baseline in both groups. Interestingly enough, this study started out with the placebo group for some reason had a much higher level of ADHD symptoms, which was bizarre. So there was a little bit of a difference there. But you can see those receiving iron continued to have a decrease in ADHD symptoms at week 8 and week 12. A lot of papers didn't really, other papers didn't really like this study. It was a small study and they didn't randomize anybody. These numbers here show different rating scales and the decrease in ADHD symptoms. There is an effect of iron supplementation, but it wasn't necessarily something that people felt confident in making a recommendation that people with ADHD need to be supplemented with iron. So the jury is still out, unfortunately, related to iron supplementation. Again, this is the ADHD score, which they actually found a significant effect on this rating scale as opposed to the other ones. Why they found an effect on one rating scale versus another, I'm not sure. Again, it kind of leads to questions about the study. So this is an interesting study also that looked at the ferritin concentration, how that relates to how much of a medication for ADHD that you might need to achieve an effect. And this actually got a lot of traction because now in the world of pediatrics, there's talk that, if we think, oh gosh, a stimulant medication is not working, then maybe we need to give them iron to see if we can boost the effect of the stimulant medication. So they found that there's relatively decent linear association between your ferritin concentration and the total dose of amphetamine needed to achieve treatment effect for ADHD. So the higher the ferritin, the more iron you have stored in your body, the less amount of the amphetamine that you need. Does this actually translate to practice? Not really. Like we don't really, think about iron, especially, if there's no other symptoms of iron deficiency or restless legs or anything like that, we don't go chasing this if stimulant medications are not working. Because the mean effect, the effect is not going to be something that, if you're going from a ferritin of 30 and you've got a daily dose of 3.3 milligrams per kilogram, you go up to 40 and you're at 0.25 milligrams per kilogram. Is it going to be a significant difference? Not really. So, interestingly enough, again, we talk a lot about the body ferritin, we talked about serum iron. There have been studies that have recently started to look at brain iron, so the iron that's sitting around in your brain. And it's an interesting concept because they've actually found that there are real quantifiable differences in the amount of iron that you have in your brain in people with ADHD versus people who don't have ADHD. So the thought is that, is this a biomarker potentially for ADHD? It may be related to genetic factors, so differences in how iron gets into the brain. It may not be related to how much iron you have in the rest of your body at all. So we still have a lot of work to do to understand that. But brain iron is a topic that is of interest these days. It's just a word to mention zinc and magnesium. I mention these because if you meet anybody with ADHD or a family of a child with ADHD, they're going to talk about zinc and magnesium because these things kind of get a lot of press. We know that zinc deficiency is known to lead to neurocognitive deficits. That's pretty clear. There is an overall meta-analysis that does show that zinc supplementation can improve symptoms of ADHD. But that being said, many of the studies that showed benefit were conducted in countries like Turkey and Iran, where there's a high prevalence of zinc deficiency. So many of the studies that were done were in these countries, and so those who tried to replicate the findings in the United States really didn't find that same result. So interestingly enough, zinc deficiency, if you treat it, ADHD gets better. If you don't necessarily have a frank zinc deficiency, then zinc is really not going to work. I did have a patient whose parents gave him both zinc and magnesium, and they said it worked fantastically for 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden, he was back to ADHD. I don't really know how to explain that, but it wasn't going to work really anyway, probably in the long run, so they stopped doing that. Magnesium, there were a few case control studies that demonstrated magnesium deficiency in kids with ADHD, but really an overall meta-analysis didn't show any difference in blood levels of magnesium. Magnesium is important for neurologic functioning in many ways, but there were mostly uncontrolled studies looking at magnesium. There were very few randomized controlled trials that showed very mixed results overall. And the thing about magnesium that I think is the takeaway is that sometimes if you dose magnesium in a not so smart way, then you can get into trouble. It can be dangerous if not monitored carefully, from diarrhea to other kind of metabolic disturbances and other things. So you don't want to mess around with magnesium if you can help it. And that being said, there was a study that looked at quite a number of kids to try to see if they did have differences in the overall vitamin and mineral concentrations in their blood. And so if you can see this red box, this shows all of the vitamins and minerals where there was a significant difference. And so vitamin B12, ADHD patients didn't have as much vitamin B12, folate, vitamin B6, and ferritin, as we had talked about before. Are these differences clinically significant? Not really sure, but there is a difference. So sometimes these get traction in terms of what people want to try for ADHD. Now down here is all the fatty acids, the polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, saturated fatty acids, and the omega-3 fatty acids. They did find clinically or statistically significant differences in fatty acids. And we'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. Again, fatty acids are something that we talk about a lot. This was a study of kids from elementary schools in Taiwan, interestingly enough. How generalizable is that? I don't know. They did find quite a number of differences. Same study looked at nutrition intake of these kids, and what they found was that there was a statistically significant difference in the amount of vegetables, fruit, and milk that people with ADHD were eating compared to controls. They didn't eat nearly enough of they didn't eat as much of the nutrient-dense foods as those in the control group. In fact, the kids with ADHD ate more of the nutrient-poor foods. You can tell it's a study from Taiwan because they include things like instant noodle and shaved ice desserts, which if you haven't been to Snow Shavery off of 280, then you should go there because they have some awesome shaved ice desserts. Takeaway was that people with ADHD seem to have dietary differences. And that includes things like fish that has a lot of fatty acids in it, particularly the omega-3 fatty acids, meats, and many other nutrient-dense foods. So why that is, we will get into that. But let's talk about essential fatty acids. So DHA and arachidonic acid, AA or ARA, are found in abundance in the human brain. These need to be provided by the diet. They're essential. And so there have been consistent reports and very convincing reports of low blood levels of omega-3 fatty acids in individuals with ADHD symptoms. As you can see, this is a meta-analysis of blood levels of fatty acids in patients with ADHD compared to patients without ADHD. So as you can see, it trends towards lower levels of fatty acids in children with ADHD. This is something that gained a lot of traction, and now we talk very frequently about omega-3 fatty acid supplementation in for folks with ADHD to see if that can help. This is important because I think many families and many individuals with ADHD are a little bit wary of the medications that we often use for ADHD. So stimulant medications like Ritalin and others have some side effects, and many people are interested in dietary treatments for ADHD. So we go through all these things quite a bit. Does fatty acid supplementation actually help? Yeah, there seems to be a little bit of a trend towards decreased ADHD symptoms across multiple studies that people have looked at. They are mixed results overall, some dramatically showing a decrease in ADHD symptoms, some not so much, and some really not showing a difference at all. Interestingly enough, the more favorable results were seen in randomized controlled trials with an N of greater than 50, a minimum duration of 15 weeks of treatment, and then they wanted to supplement with EPA and DHA, not just one or the other. There's the thought that for children, you can't just give somebody a fatty acid supplement for like a few weeks to see if there's any difference in ADHD symptoms. Apparently there's a lot of turnover of fatty acids in the brains of adults, but in children, that turnover is much slower. So if you're going to supplement, you may need a longer term supplementation to see any kind of effect, like even up to 6 or more months of supplementation. So it's not something that's very quick to appreciate. I always tell families it's heart healthy anyway, so if you want to give a fatty acid supplement, that's fine. But we may not see any benefits. There was a prescription medical food that was on the market for a while. It is no longer on the market. It was called Viarin. It was a fatty acid supplement that was packaged in a way to say that, hey, this is a fatty acid that we have gotten to cross the blood-brain barrier in a very quick way. And so people were out there asking about Viarin. They were presenting at conferences and saying, hey, we got a medical food to treat ADHD. And it's not a stimulant medication, so it's safe and it's awesome and you should give everybody this. Wasn't covered by insurance, was actually quite expensive. I never had anybody take it. Even the ones who I said, okay, fine, I'll prescribe it to you, just to see what happens, they decided not to take it anyway. And now it's off the market. They were challenged to provide evidence of their claims, and then they said, for other reasons, we have decided to shift our marketing strategy and our products, and Viarin is now off the market. So go figure. So what about other types of diets in general related to ADHD? So this was a study that wanted to look at the Mediterranean diet and ADHD. So the Mediterranean diet is thought to be one of the healthiest diets, and so it's got a lot of fatty acids in it, a lot of other things, fiber. And so people want to look at this, and this was the KidMed score, which is a way to survey people for how much they're adhering to the Mediterranean diet. And so they found differences in regular fish consumption between the cases of ADHD and controls. People with ADHD were not eating as much regular fish or as often. They found difference in having cereals for breakfast. There was not as many people in the cases eating cereal or cereal products for breakfast. Check this out. So those with ADHD were more often skipping breakfast than the controls were. This is like a no-brainer. Like, give your kids breakfast. Like, they will learn better, right? They'll focus better. So, it's good to have some evidence to back that up. And then commercially baked goods or pastries. There were a lot more folks with ADHD eating commercially baked goods or pastries for breakfast instead of more nutrient-rich fiber or fatty acid type stuff. And so if you eat the wrong things for breakfast, like a quick hit of sugar or a quick hit of carbohydrates, then you're going to become more inattentive later on in the day and have more ADHD symptoms, and that's certainly understandable. So there's been a lot of interest in different diet types and ADHD over the years. This is a timeline that shows how that interest has evolved. So as I started out talking about the food colors, the additives in foods, that was something that went way back into the 1970s. People in Kaiser Permanente were like, yeah, this is a problem, we need to fix this. And so they came up with a diet, and we'll talk about that. Then there were megadose vitamins, and sugar became a hot topic, and then amino acids like phenylalanine, became popular. The few foods diet we'll also talk about, and that's kind of a elimination diet that's supposed to kind of eliminate anything that is potentially antigenic in the diet. People have looked at magnesium, iron, zinc, as we talked about, and then fish oil was more of a recent thing. So it's always been a kind of a thing since the 1970s. But people have studied very specific dietary patterns to see whether or not it may help with ADHD. So the Fine Gold, or the Kaiser Permanente diet, was to say, let's eliminate all the artificial colorings and salicylates in the diet. This diet includes apples, grapes, lunch meats, sausage, hot dogs, cold drinks with it eliminates apples, grapes, lunch meats, sausage, hot dogs, cold drinks with artificial colorings and flavors. People were asked to adhere to this diet, and they studied it, pretty intensively back in the day. And overall, there weren't really any convincing results. There was mixed things, and so there's not a whole lot of evidence to say that food colors affect you. Does that mean that there may be one person for whom you give somebody food with a dye in it or something like that, and they're going to get more hyper? No, that's certainly still possible, because these studies are not ever meant to suggest that there may be an individual response to food colors or any other kind of foods. But overall, the net benefit was not really clear from doing the Fine Gold diet. Same thing with sugar and sweeteners, believe it or not. So many of these studies are older, back in the days when sugar was a popular topic. But a meta-analysis done in 1995 concluded no significant effect of sugar on behavior or cognitive functioning of children. Again, these results are not individualizable. Interestingly enough, they said aspartame had no effect on behavior. So despite the fact that aspartame contributes to the level of phenylalanine in your body, they said, yeah, it doesn't really do anything. And then there was the few foods diet. This was like, let's just cut out all the things and let's prescribe a few foods for you. and see if this makes a difference. So there were two meats, 2 carbs, 2 vegetables, 2 fruits, oil, and water. There were 7 studies total that looked at this, and they often had significant limitations. The sample size was too small, the blinded nature of it was not reliable. Again, if you're eating a diet that has these things in it, like, it's really hard to kind of blind you to do it. There were some studies that were able to do some double-blind challenges. And interestingly enough, all of the studies, including the ones with the double-blind challenge of the Few Foods diet, did show a trend towards improvement. And so what that means is still kind of unclear. There's not a consensus as to whether or not this is a good approach to take, and we don't often clinically recommend this. Because one, it's really hard to follow, especially if there are other kids or other people in the house who want to eat more than just these foods. It takes a lot of effort to follow this diet. So it may be something that helps people with ADHD, but again, it may be an individualizable thing, and we can't necessarily do it across the board because it's so hard to follow. Now, again, there's been many studies that have looked at a healthy versus unhealthy diet, whatever that means. And many studies actually use the term Western diet to describe the unhealthy diet, because we all know we eat pretty poorly here. And so several studies have reported either higher odds of ADHD or psychiatric symptoms with the unhealthy dietary pattern. But disrupted eating patterns have also been linked to a higher risk of ADHD. So we get into kind of a chicken and the egg problem with whether or not diet contributes to ADHD, or whether ADHD predisposes you to have a bad diet. But abnormal eating patterns specifically seen in individuals with ADHD have been shown to be associated with increased odds of obesity. And I will talk about that in a couple of slides. But first I'll just mention this because this is a hot topic in everything that we do in developmental behavioral pediatrics now. So the gut-brain connection. There has been more evidence that is starting to convince most of us that there is some connection between your gut and how that talks to the brain and how it influences how you behave. And in particular for ADHD, there may be a couple of routes to that. So on the left you see the vagus nerve pathway. This doesn't really link to the diet so much. It's more physiologic in nature. The vagus nerve connects many of the parts of the gut to the brain, and if there's abnormal signaling there, it can relate to cognitive performance and ADHD symptoms. The more interesting one that kind of relates to what you put in your body is the neurometabolic pathway, where bacteria can produce or affect the neurotransmitters that you that you have in your body. So one of those is dopamine. Certain bacteria can affect the production of dopamine precursors and may modulate the expression of the D1 receptor. So it can do a lot of things if you have certain bacteria. Particularly the bifidobacterium is related to that. Serotonin, there are several serotonin-producing bacteria that if you have an imbalance in those bacteria, it can make your serotonin do some strange things. Some bacteria produce vitamin B6, but no studies have clearly shown a lack of B6-producing bacteria in ADHD patients. And then the dietary fiber that you take in, there are some bacteria that ferment this, and it produces short-chain fatty acids. Which can actually increase the production of enzymes that make more neurotransmitters. So there's a lot of things that can affect you, and your diet can certainly play a role in how that works. There's also the immune pathway, where there may be a higher incidence of autoimmune diseases, genetic polymorphisms that lead to inflammatory molecules around. So if there may be any foods that may be quote-unquote triggers, and it's hard to say because this is super individualizable, then that can lead to the immune pathway of gut-brain connection. So the last thing that I want to talk about is ADHD and obesity, because we know, and this has been studied quite a lot, is that there is a link between ADHD and obesity. So this is another meta-analysis, and again, the diamond at the bottom is the important diamond that shows you whether or not there may be an association, and there is an increased risk of obesity. There's a 27% higher odds of obesity in individuals with ADHD compared to those who don't have ADHD. And this has been replicated multiple times. This is adjusted for psychiatric comorbidities and socioeconomic status. So the prevalence of obesity was 70% higher in adults with ADHD and 40% higher in children with ADHD than matched controls. Interestingly enough, this particular study found that those who were medicated did not have an increased risk of obesity compared to those who were unmedicated. And I will show you that in a minute. So why are individuals with ADHD more likely to be obese? So we talked about the inappropriate dietary patterns. We talked about how people may eat less of the healthy foods and more of the not so great foods. Who have ADHD. There are also documented differences in physical activity in individuals with ADHD, and not in like the direction that says like these people are hyper, they move a lot more. It's actually the opposite. And more recently, that may be related to the fact that many of these individuals with ADHD spend a lot more time in front of screens, so phones, computers, TVs, tablets, all of the things that we have available to hook us and make us sit there. There may be some genetic links. There have been some genes that have been associated with ADHD and obesity, and also sleep disruption. And again, this is a chicken and egg kind of thing. If people with ADHD aren't sleeping for some reason, then we know that sleep problems can actually lead to an increase in problems with weight gain for many reasons. But as we've talked about, the directionality of causation is not established. We don't know whether or not ADHD itself predisposes you to obesity or whether or not obesity may predispose you to have more ADHD symptoms. And it's still something that we're trying to flesh out. So we talked about the effect of stimulant medication, and that individuals with ADHD who are untreated with stimulant medication had a 43% higher odds of developing obesity. Those treated for ADHD with medication showed no increased risk of obesity. Why is that? And now probably the thing that, if you know anything about stimulant medications, you know that one of the universal side effects from a stimulant medication is that it suppresses your appetite. And so the first knee-jerk reaction is this something that's related to appetite suppression? Are we suppressing people's appetite, and that's why they're not having a huge increase in weight? Well, there have been some studies that have tried to answer that question. So a study in 2017 looked at how the initiation of stimulant medication may lead to changes in BMI. And so early initiation of stimulant medication, so earlier than third grade, so to speak, causes a drop in BMI short term, and that may be related to the appetite suppression. But in fact, BMI had increased growth in 5th through 8th grade, independent of dietary and physical activity. So it didn't really matter how much they were eating. It didn't matter how much they were moving. Many of those folks going from 5th to the 8th grade actually showed an increase in BMI. Now, was that an increase that was clinically significant or trending towards overweight or obesity? Not necessarily, but there was a rebound effect of BMI the longer people took a stimulant medication. And in fact, other studies, like the one in 2009, look specifically at treating ADHD in adults with refractory obesity. And so this study was looking at people with obesity, and then they actually tested them for ADHD to say, oh, like, are these folks who we're trying to treat and get them to lose weight, maybe they have ADHD, let's actually look at this. And in fact, they identified many people who did not actually have a diagnosis of ADHD, that they went on to diagnose ADHD, and so they treated them. And those who were treated actually had an average of 12.3% weight loss from initial weight after 466 days of continuous treatment. And so they actually were able to make progress with their refractory obesity by treating the ADHD. And this was actually not thought to be due to appetite suppression effect, because the appetite suppression effect was seen to go away after 4 to 6 weeks. So it was a small fraction of the 466 days of treatment that people had. And the reason why they think that treating ADHD helped was that there was an increased self-directedness and persistence and decrease in novelty-seeking behaviors. And this is kind of intuitive. If you think about how ADHD works, you are a setup for novelty seeking. You're a setup for the reward pathway, just wanting to grab everything. And so if there's something like sugar or donuts or something like that that you just have to have, you're not going to necessarily have the inhibitive capacity to prevent yourself from saying, you know, I don't need to eat that. Like, I need to eat something else. So you're going to go for that donut every single time. or more often than not. And so, those who are treated with ADHD, they may have more of a feeling of control over how they can make choices, and when prescribed diets for obesity or other things, that helps them be more successful. So ADHD may often be some unrecognized component to refractory obesity, and it's always worth thinking about. Again, the ADHD obesity link, may or may not necessarily relate to the medications that they are on, but it is a link that is well established. So it is something that we often talk about, and it's something we often see clinically, that many of the folks we see with ADHD often have some weight gain that is not favorable. So I know I'm the last person to talk today, and I think that now is a good time for a summary. In summary, diet may be a factor in ADHD, but how to specifically modulate the diet is likely to be determined by individual patient factors. It is always a discussion that we have with our patients with ADHD. It just is a discussion that happens in a different way every single time with every patient that we see. We know some information, and we know some things that are generalized about ADHD, like differences in ferritin or fatty acids or things like that, but how that actually plays out for an individual always remains to be seen until we kind of have that conversation with each patient. There is no clear and convincing evidence to recommend supplementation with vitamins, minerals, or other nutrients. The ones that don't necessarily hurt, like fatty acids, we're like, if you want to try it, go ahead. If you've got something that you can take and it's not going to break the bank, then go ahead. But there's really not a lot of evidence to recommend as a standard treatment for ADHD. There's conflicting evidence of elimination type diets. Again, like healthy diets just have numerous benefits. Like if you're going to eat a healthy diet, then you're going to be okay most of the time. And so not just for ADHD, for like everything in your life. And so we always recommend a healthy diet, as many pediatricians do for many of the kids that they see. ADHD itself is prone to lead to dietary alterations, which may affect overall health and that gut-brain axis functioning. How that translates to real world what we do is still something that remains to be seen. ADHD and obesity are linked, but directional causality remains to be determined. If we're trying to help folks with weight loss, then consider ADHD as a potentially unrecognized factor in difficult to treat obesity. So again, that was a very ADHD-like romp through ADHD and nutrition. That is the end of my talk, and I will open myself up to any questions that y'all may have. Yes?
Have you seen any differences in symptoms and nutritional treatment by race?
Not specifically off the top of my head. I really actually have not found studies looking at it. That's an excellent question. I don't think many studies have really specifically focused on that. I think many of the randomized controlled trials that I've looked at control for it, but nobody was looking for specific differences. I think it's always something that was ended up being controlled for and not looked at specifically, but that is a fantastic question. Clinically, it's hard to tell, just based on my clinical experience. Many times, the dietary interventions just are not feasible, if we want to try something. And so, oftentimes in clinic, we just find that families aren't able to comply with it. And there's really no difference by race or ethnicity based on that. So, a lot of times we end up still just kind of managing things with our tried and true stuff. But that is an excellent question. I would love to know more about that. So I'll probably go and search a little bit more about that. Yes?
I guess to bounce off of that, have you seen studies that look into differences by gender?
There were a couple of studies that looked at gender, and they actually didn't really find a significant difference. It's actually a little bit tricky to do that too, because of the way the studies are recruited. If you can imagine the gender differences in studies for ADHD, it's going to be a lot more boys than girls. There may have been a lot of studies that weren't necessarily powered appropriately to find any meaningful differences. Definitely in the larger studies, there weren't really any meaningful differences there. Again, there's a super wide gender imbalance between boys and girls related to who has ADHD diagnosis. So, as you can imagine, many of the studies included mostly boys. It's also similar to many of the autism studies that are out there. But again, these are all very excellent questions. Other questions? Sweet. Well, all right. I am the last person, so thank you for your attention.